Hey everyone out there in internet land, it's your old pal Mike Radich, and welcome to the commentary track for Enter the Lone Ranger from 1949, or The Lone Ranger Story from 1952. And I say or because this version of Enter the Lone Ranger that we're going to watch is the three-part saga that kicked off the legendary TV series starring Clayton Moore as the daring and resourceful masked rider of the plains known as the Lone Ranger, and Jay Silverheels as his faithful Indian companion Tonto. This is that three-part saga edited together to make a full movie. Because originally, when this aired, it was the first 3 episodes of the TV series, with cliffhangers dividing up the 3 episodes. It wasn't until 1952 when this version actually aired, and it was titled The Lone Ranger Story. So technically, we're going to be watching Enter the Lone Ranger, but we also could say we're going to be watching The Lone Ranger Story, but you get what I'm saying. And this has been re-released many, many times over the years. It's been released on television many times over the years. It's been released on VHS many times over the years. It's been released on DVD many times over the years in various forms, whether it's divided up individually into the 3 episodes, whether it's been edited together and plays as a feature film. It's been titled differently over the years. The version that we're going to be watching is just titled simply The Lone Ranger. Some versions are Enter the Lone Ranger, some versions are The Lone Ranger Story, some versions are The Legend of the Lone Ranger, some versions are titled as The Origin of the Lone Ranger. Depends on what version you get of it, depending on what home video style you bought it on. Whether it's on VHS, it could differ from what it is titled on DVD. But mainly this version of the film we're going to be watching today either goes by Enter the Lone Ranger or The Legend of the Lone Ranger. Not to be confused with the film of the same name from 1981, but this film has fallen into public domain, so it's been released by basically everyone, and it's been retitled by everyone because people have tried to cash in on this being under public domain. If they title it all the same, well then some people might not buy it. But if you title it differently, some people will think, oh, well, this is a different movie. That's what they've done to me over the years, because I own 2 copies of this on VHS. I own one that's called Enter the Lone Ranger, and I own one that's called The Legend of the Lone Ranger. And now this one that I own on DVD, which is the one I'm going to be watching today, is just called simply The Lone Ranger. And it's released by Alpha Video back in 2002. It was released by Alpha Video back in 2002. You could get it on www.oldies.com back then. I don't know if that website still works, but it says that's where you can find movies like this on DVD if you go to that website. But that's the version I'm going to be watching today as I do this commentary track. And let me just quickly read to you what it says on the back of this, and then we'll get into the movie. But it says, the true origins of the legendary masked man. Clayton Moore stars as the legendary Lone Ranger with Jay Silverheels as his faithful Indian companion Tonto in this story of the origin of the West's most mysterious hero. 6 Texas Rangers, led by Captain Dan Reed, set out to capture the notorious Cavendish Gang. They are led into a trap as they ride through the narrow path in the cliffs known as Bryant's Gap, where they are brutally ambushed. All of the Rangers are shot and left for dead. Tonto, a Mohawk Indian scout, wrong, he was Potawatomi. But anyways, I'll play along. A Mohawk Indian scout happens upon the scene of the massacre and discovers one of the Rangers half alive. Carrying the badly wounded man to shelter of a nearby cave, Tonto nurses him back to health. The survivor, John Reed, tells his story to Tonto, and the two become friends. Not exactly accurate, as you'll see in the movie, but I'll play along again. They were boyhood friends, that's why I say that. Tonto already knew who John Reed was. But anyways, wearing a mask as a memorial to his fallen comrades and to protect his identity, armed with silver bullets, astride the magnificent white stallion Silver, the Lone Ranger is born. Vowing to bring justice to the Cavendish gang, the Lone Ranger will go on to strike fear and terror into the hearts of all who would do evil in the Old West. That's what it says on the back of this DVD box. It says this was released in 1949 in black and white, and the runtime for this film is 69 minutes. Actually, when I bought this, I thought this was the 1956 Lone Ranger feature film, but it's just Enter the Lone Ranger, and I was kind of disappointed about that because I already own this on VHS in 2 different forms, but now that VHS has been completely phased out and DVD and Blu-ray have taken over, and they haven't released this on Blu-ray, I'm kind of happy that I have this now. But now that we have that out of the way, let's get into the movie. Okay, now we're ready. I've turned down the volume on my TV just so that we don't have competing sounds, because if you still want to watch the movie with the volume on, I don't want to have your volume mixed with my voice, mixed with my volume from the movie. So I've turned off my volume just so that we won't have competing sounds. Now, currently, I'm looking at a blank screen. Now, when I hit play, the movie's going to start playing. So I want us to be synced up. So when I hit play and you hit play, we're all together, and I'm not going to be ahead of you, or you're not going to be ahead of me. I'm not going to be behind you. You're not going to be behind me. So we're going to do this on the count of 3, and once we hit play, hopefully we'll be in sync together. Now, if you're not watching the movie because you've seen it 1,000 times and you're just listening to the commentary track, it won't matter. But if you're watching this movie as you're hearing my voice, I want us to be together. So on the count of 3, we're going to do 1, 2, 3, and then we're going to play the movie. So here we go. 1, 2, 3, play. And now we're playing. Now we have the opening from the 4th season of the Lone Ranger TV series. So from 1954 to 1955, this was the opening on this particular DVD that I'm watching. Now, if you're watching on a VHS or another DVD, you might have the traditional opening that they use right now, because obviously the show is in syndication. They use the decolorized version of the 5th season opening. So that might be the opening you're seeing. So here we are. Nice little shot of the Lone Ranger, Enter the Lone Ranger. He's at the Lone Ranger's Rock at Iverson Ranch. Rides down into the gorge. Great shot. We have Gerald Moore doing the announcing and the narration for this movie. He did the first 18 episodes of the Lone Ranger TV series before he left the show. His last episode was Outlaw Town. That's the last episode that they used that opening. So when you just saw Enter the Lone Ranger in that text, Outlaw Town, the 18th episode of this show, was the last opening they used that little title card with. And here's a nice shot of the 6 Texas Rangers on their way to Bryant's Gap with Collins leading them there. That scene over time was used over and over again, because at this point in time, the show was compiling stock footage. So they had to go out and shoot all this stuff, and they spent a lot of money on these first 3 episodes, because they had to get all the footage and then use it down the road. So they spent a lot of money now, but they saved a lot of money for the rest of season 1 and 2 and 3 and 4. And of course, in season 5, they went to color, and the format was totally different because Jack Rather had taken over the character, but that's a story for a different day. But we're going to be seeing a lot of scenes in this movie that we're going to see down the road in the Lone Ranger TV series. So in this pilot, whatever you want to call it, this first episode, even though this is a feature film edited together, the first 3 episodes of the show, we're going to see a lot of scenes that we're going to see later, and this is where they came from. So here's George J. Lewis talking with one of the Rangers, and you'll notice that Clayton Moore is sitting to the left of Collins, the right of us as we watch this movie. He's in the chair. He just said right and stood up and walked away. That's Clayton Moore. And you can also see that Clayton Moore is riding, he's the last rider on the right. So he's way in the back and he's on the right-hand side. And what I love about this movie is that they don't hide him during this ambush scene. In the 1938 Lone Ranger serial, obviously that was a different format because Lee Powell and Lane Chandler and Herman Briggs and George Montgomery and all those other guys who were the Rangers in that movie, it was a mystery and it was a Guess Who story. So they couldn't show him in the ambush because then you would see, oh, it's Lee Powell who was the Lone Ranger in that movie. Spoilers. In that movie serial, it was that Guess Who story, so they couldn't have him in here. Now they have Clayton Moore in this ambush. They do a good job of hiding him, but I love that he's in there. I think that's great. Now, the actor on the right is obviously George J. Lewis. He's someone who had been kicking around Hollywood for a very long time. He's best known for playing Don Alejandro de la Vega in the Walt Disney Zorro TV series starring Guy Williams. He plays the father in that. And a fun fact about George J. Lewis is he played Clayton Moore's faithful Indian companion in The Ghost of Zorro, released earlier this year, so 1949. This is the year that this pilot, or first episode, however you want to put it, was released. And that serial had been released earlier, a few months before they started this Lone Ranger TV series. And you know, Clayton Moore, you can't do anything without a faithful Indian companion. In The Ghost of Zorro, he had George J. Lewis, and in The Lone Ranger, obviously he had Jay Silverheels as Tonto, his faithful Indian companion. He can't do anything without a faithful Indian companion, this guy. But George J. Lewis, very talented actor, always a bad guy, normally. Sometimes he's a good guy, but mostly known for playing a heavy. Had a great performance in another Clayton Moore serial, The Adventures of Frank and Jesse James. He plays the action heavy in that, and I thought he was phenomenal in that. And he'd been around, he'd been in a ton of B-Westerns, a ton of serials, had a long career, very talented guy. If you want to see a more comedic side of George J. Lewis, I recommend that you watch the Three Stooges short, Malice in the Palace, and that's hilarious. It's a Shemp, so if you're not a fan of Shemp, you might have to get over that, but it's a very funny episode. He's in the beginning of that. He's one of the guys that the Three Stooges are waiting on during that short. So it's very funny. I highly recommend that. If you haven't seen it, check it out. So George J. Lewis is looking over the ambush. He sees that the Cavendish gang have got it all marked out. And Glenn Strange is the actor who plays Butch Cavendish. He's best known for playing Sam Noonan, the bartender in Gunsmoke. But I always think of him as Butch Cavendish. When I see him on Gunsmoke, I say, hey, there's Butch Cavendish. A lot of people see him in this and say, hey, there's Sam the bartender. Glenn Strange is a very interesting guy because this is his second appearance in a Lone Ranger production. Now, you're probably thinking, well, how can that be? Mike, you have to be wrong. How can this be his second production when this is the first episode of Lone Ranger TV series? How can this be? Well, he was the action heavy in the 1939 Republic serial, The Lone Ranger Rides Again. He was in that. That was the second Lone Ranger serial that starred Robert Livingston as the Lone Ranger, and Glenn Strange was in that movie. Did a really good job. Kind of got lost in that serial, but still stood out as a very good heavy. And he'd been kicking around Hollywood also. That's a common theme of a lot of these guys. Glenn Strange is actually related to two famous Western stars of that era. He's cousins with both Roy Rogers and Rex Allen. Now, the Rex Allen connection is more well known because that's been reported on a ton of websites. But the Roy Rogers connection I learned of through Roy Rogers' daughter, Cheryl Rogers Barnett. She told me she doesn't know how they're related. I think Rex Allen and Glenn Strange are like third or fourth cousins. I think Roy Rogers and Glenn Strange are cousins by marriage. I'm not exactly sure because she said that she wasn't sure how they were related, but he's related to those two famous Western stars. Now here's the ambush, a very well done ambush. This is a great scene. A little fun fact about this scene is the Rangers are in Bronson Canyon. That's where this ambush is taking place, but Glenn Strange, he's not there. The Rangers are fighting air, and they're fighting some guys who are at Bronson Canyon, but Glenn Strange, he's at Iverson's ranch. That's where he's at. That rock that he's behind is not at Bronson Canyon. A few of these guys you can tell that they're at Bronson Canyon, but Glenn Strange, he's not there at all. He's at Iverson's. Now here's Clayton Moore. Obviously him, you can tell. He really loves to just devour the gun. He has this really, really tight, high grip on his gun. And there you can kind of tell Glenn Strange he's not at he's not at Bronson Canyon. He's at Iverson's. You can kind of tell the rocks are different. So George J. Lewis, a.k.a. Collins, he's getting his orders from someone. It's just not Glenn Strange. I mean, it's Glenn Strange in this movie, but not at Bronson Canyon. Glenn Strange is in a totally different location. I learned that recently. I always thought he was there. They did a great job with this scene. Now Collins is checking all the bodies. One actor that I failed to talk about earlier because I got caught talking about George J. Lewis and Glenn Strange back-to-back is Tris Coffin. He plays Dan Reed in this movie, the Lone Ranger's brother. And he's another guy who had been kicking around Hollywood, but his career had started to take a more positive turn. He was mostly known for being a heavy in westerns and other serials and action-adventure type stuff. He was known for being a heavy, but in 1949, his career started to change. Here he is playing a good guy. Unfortunately, he dies in this movie, but he's playing the Lone Ranger's brother in this movie as Collins gets shot by Butch Cavendish. There he is at Iverson's, those three guys. But Tris Coffin not only played the Lone Ranger's brother in 1949, but he also played Rocket Man. He played Jeff King / Rocket Man in the 1949 Republic serial King of the Rocket Men. So he had been starting to turn a corner, and later on, as the series progressed, he made another appearance in a Lone Ranger episode called Cannonball McKay. He played a marshal. So here he is playing all these good guy roles, but it was short-lived because as the show went on, and as more and more westerns got put on the air, he returned to his old ways and was once again cast as a bad guy. He appears in 5 episodes of the Lone Ranger TV series. The final 3 that he appears in, he plays a bad guy. And he's another guy who had been working at Republic with Clayton Moore. He plays the brains heavy in the 1947 Republic serial that starred Clayton Moore as Jesse James, called Jesse James Rides Again, and was phenomenal. Great actor. All these guys are great actors. They don't make guys like this anymore, unfortunately. Here's Clayton Moore. Clearly him. You can tell it's him. Love how they don't hide it. They just let him do his thing. Puts his bandana. Some people call it a scarf, but it's a bandana. I don't know why there's the confusion, but there is. Here's George J. Lewis, a.k.a. Collins. Still alive. Now he's got to get to shelter so he doesn't roast to death in this desert canyon. So he's got to nurse his wounds, find shade, and he's off. And now here's our guy, Jay Silverheels, a.k.a. Tonto. He appears for the first time. Jay Silverheels, absolutely perfect for this role. There really was no guy at that point in time that you could really turn to and say, okay, this guy could be Tonto, except for Jay Silverheels. He's perfect for the role. And this was a really big moment in Westerns. It's a really big moment because this is one of the original TV series, Western TV series produced for television. So it's historical in that, but it's also historical that, okay, on radio, it was the same thing, but it was different because now TV, it's no longer theater of the mind. You can actually see it. So when you see Jay Silverheels, it becomes obvious. You know, in radio, your mind wanders. You know, everyone has a different picture of what they're seeing. But on TV, everyone's seeing the same thing. So when you see Jay Silverheels, you're like, wow, this guy is a sidekick? It's amazing because normally we've been conditioned to see the sidekicks in Westerns as background players or guys brought in for comic relief or guys who need to be mentored, guys who are not viewed as equals. I always think back to those Hopalong Cassidy movies with Johnny or Lucky or one of those other young guys that used to ride around with Hopalong Cassidy. Not viewed as equals. And then you have obviously Smiley Burnett and Gabby Hayes and all these other guys who were brought in. Pat Brady, he's another one. Guys who were brought in for comic relief. But Jay Silverheels, he's one of those guys. You can make the case that he's better looking than Clayton Moore. And you feel confident about Jay Silverheels, a.k.a. Tonto. You feel good about him. Just in case something happened to the Lone Ranger, you'd feel good about him taking over and saving the day. If the Lone Ranger broke his leg or got sick, you'd feel good. You'd feel confident. Oh, you know, hey, evil's not going to win because this guy can solve it. If something happens to Roy Rogers or Gene Autry and we have to have Smiley Burnett or Pat Brady or one of these other guys, we're in big trouble. So that was a really big thing because now this was a sidekick, but he was an equal. And he was a really good partner to the Lone Ranger. And the guy's really handsome. I know Richard Martin, who was the sidekick of Tim Holt, he was a very handsome guy, but he's still that comic relief type sidekick. This was the first time that the sidekick was equal with the main hero. A lot of people have problems with the dialogue because a lot of the other movies that Jay Silverheels appeared in, he didn't have this type of dialogue. His voice didn't sound like this. He just talked in his normal voice. He didn't say the stuff that he's saying in this movie. But the reason why the dialogue is like this is because it's a holdover from radio. Because all of these episodes are either direct adaptations of the Lone Ranger radio show or multiple episodes reworked together to make a new episode. That's where this whole dialogue thing came into place, because again, you can't see anything on radio. So to figure out who's talking, and if it was an Indian talking, since you can't see that it's an Indian, they had to come up. I mean, it's ridiculous. It sounds ridiculous, even me saying it, but I'm just trying to tell you why they did it, just so that they could allow the audience to understand who was talking, and if it was an Indian talking, they would have that dialogue, and that's still a holdover from radio. And also, another thing that I see fans critique about Tonto on this show is, why did he always ask all these obvious questions? Well, that's another holdover from radio, because you can't see anything, so he has to do something to push along the story. We always can't have the narrator doing everything, because we'd have 30 minutes of narration. So Tonto has to ask the Lone Ranger questions so that we can move the story forward. That's why Tonto did all these obvious questions on this show. Even though we could see it, it was just because these are adaptations of the radio show. Excuse me. Here's Clayton Moore for the first time putting on his mask, putting on his white hat, putting on his gun belt. And Clayton Moore is another guy who really is the only actor who could have played this part during this era. I know it's easy for me to say this in 2018 about a show that's almost 70 years old, but he really is, because if you look at all the available actors of that time, guys like George Reeves, who went on to play Superman, he could have maybe been a serviceable Lone Ranger. That might have been interesting. But all these other guys, Judd Holdren, Kane Richmond, Dennis Moore, Robert Lowry, Robert Kent, Charles Quigley, Richard Simmons, no, not Richard Simmons, the fitness guru. Richard Simmons, the actor from Sergeant Preston of the Yukon. He was another one who possibly could have been up for the part of the Lone Ranger. Henry Lauder, he's another one. He appeared on this show several times. A lot of these guys that I named off appeared on this show several times. The only actor that I ever heard of, well, I've heard of three, but the only actor that is kind of off the wall that I heard could have played the Lone Ranger was Ken Curtis. And I know what you're thinking. Ken Curtis? Festus from Gunsmoke as the Lone Ranger? You got to be kidding me. But hold on. So back then, Ken Curtis was actually a leading man. Ken Curtis, he started his career as one of the members of the Sons of the Pioneers. He was a leading man at this point in time. And in 1951, he had a great performance as Don Daredevil in the 1951 Republic serial, Don Daredevil Rides Again. So it sounds weird now, but at that time, it's possible that he could have played the Lone Ranger. I've heard that he was up for the part. It makes sense because Festus, with slight modifications, that could be the old prospector. So maybe it was possible that he was up for that part. But I've heard that was the rumor. And I also heard that Robert Livingston, who I mentioned earlier, he played the Lone Ranger in the second Lone Ranger serial. He campaigned hard for this role, but by this time, his career had just faded away for whatever reason. He appears in an episode from the fourth season in 1954 called Message to Fort Apache, and he plays Major Harvey, the commander at Fort Apache, and there's clearly an age difference between him and Clayton Moore. And Robert Livingston was a handsome guy at one point in time, but he kind of lost all his looks by 1954. So he was campaigning hard. And Brace Beamer, who played the Lone Ranger on radio, because the Lone Ranger TV series and the Lone Ranger radio show overlap. 1954 is when the Lone Ranger radio show went off the air. So that show was still going on, and Brace Beamer thought, well, I'm playing the Lone Ranger on radio, why can't I play the Lone Ranger on the TV show? And there's a lot of rumors as to why he wasn't cast as the Lone Ranger. The obvious rumor is because George W. Trindle wanted to keep it separate, and he wanted to keep the radio show going. Because obviously at this point in time, nobody knew that TV was going to work out. A lot of people just thought that this was a little fad or a trend and something that people would get over. But obviously TV stuck around. So they tell me. That's one rumor. And then the other rumor is because he didn't look the part. But that's obviously not true. Brace Beamer was a great-looking guy. He was 6'3", 200 pounds, an expert horseman, a crack shot with either hand. So he was the Lone Ranger publicly. He did all the public appearances for the Lone Ranger, even when he wasn't the Lone Ranger, when Earl Grosser and other guys played the part. Oh, there goes Collins. We just saw the end of him. Now, before that, that's when the episode would have ended. So the first episode would have ended on that cliffhanger when the Lone Ranger is literally hanging on the side of this mountain. And that's where the episode would have ended. But since this is the feature-length movie version, we don't get that. But anyways, back to Beamer. It's really unclear as to why he wasn't given this part, but he really wanted it badly. Clayton Moore appeared in 169 half-hour TV episodes of The Lone Ranger. Jay Silverheels appeared in 217 episodes of the Lone Ranger TV series. He ranks number 1 for appearances. There were 221 half-hour TV shows, but Jay Silverheels suffered a heart attack and was replaced for a brief moment in time, 4 episodes, 8 weeks of filming, by Chuck Courtney, who played the Lone Ranger's nephew. Danny Reed. A lot of people get on me for that. Oh, it's Dan Reed, but it gets too confusing. Tris Coffin, in my opinion, is Dan Reed, and Chuck Courtney is Danny Reed. I like that better. It's easier. Because if I say Dan Reed, some people are like, oh, what are you saying? Are you saying the father? Are you saying the Lone Ranger's nephew? What are you saying? So I just go with Danny Reed for Chuck Courtney's character. Lone Ranger just shot a buffalo, and he's saved Silver. And now he's decided to nurse him back to health. Clayton Moore was a little stiff in these first, I'd say about 15 or 16 episodes. Maybe less. Maybe like 12. Because he tried to sound like Brace Beamer. For whatever the reason, whether it was the producers of this show told him, we want you to sound like Brace Beamer, or he just thought that it would be better if he sounded like Brace Beamer. But he tried to sound like Brace Beamer, so his speech is a little wooden and it's a little slowed down because he's trying to sound like Brace Beamer. But he'll get the hang of it. And he won't have that problem in the future because he really made the role his own because he just took over. He wasn't playing the Lone Ranger, he was the Lone Ranger. If you watch Clayton Moore's career prior to him being cast as the Lone Ranger, if you go back and watch his work that he did at Republic Pictures, he just plays the same guy. Him playing Jesse James or him playing Zorro / Ken Mason is him playing the Lone Ranger. It's the same guy. He's not trying to be the Lone Ranger. That was a problem that John Hart had later when he took over during the 3rd season of the Lone Ranger TV series. He tried to be the Lone Ranger. He wasn't acting just as how John Hart would take on any role. He was trying to act like the Lone Ranger. That's the way I can describe how these two guys perform. Clayton Moore just performs. He just acts the way he always acts. This is just another part that he's playing. John Hart, whether he was feeling pressure or just because he was inexperienced, he felt that he had to go out and do a little bit extra, and he was playing the Lone Ranger. He wasn't just playing a part, and that's why his performance wasn't that great. But Clayton Moore's a little stiff here. This is not my favorite performance of his as the Lone Ranger. Still really good. I'd rather watch this any day over Armie Hammer. So here he is with Silver. This is a very beautiful horse. A magnificent animal. The DVD box got that right. This is a great horse. And now here he is, breaking Silver, the first rider to ever be on the horse's back. Fun fact. So here he is, riding the horse. And this is a really interesting scene because this is the only time we're ever going to see this. There's no need to put this in stock footage or anything. So this was just money that was spent on this episode, this movie, however you want to put it, alone. Which doesn't seem right for the time because everybody in the B-Westerns and in the Western movie serials, they were always looking to cut costs. So it's very interesting that they'd have a scene like this where they couldn't eventually use it as stock footage, him just riding around in circles. Maybe if they went, had him riding up a trail, riding down a trail, riding up a hill, they could splice that in later, but having him just go into circles, it just only makes sense for this episode. Now that could be because Trendle didn't understand TV budgets. He didn't understand that he had to make every shot count in these early episodes so that they could use stock footage later. Or he just didn't care. He just didn't know what was going on at this time. Oh, well, he came from radio where it wasn't very expensive, so how much more expensive could TV be? And he found out later that it was very expensive. Even for a show that's not known as being a high-budget show, it adds up in the long run. So we have all these shots at Iverson's. This particular ranch is out at Iverson's. This hill that the Lone Ranger and Tonto are out at Iverson's. That's really Lone Ranger country. Iverson's and Lone Pine. Lone Pine, Hopalong Cassidy filmed a bunch of his stuff there, but the Lone Ranger filmed a bunch of his stuff there. We don't see anything in this film filmed out at Lone Pine. This is all Iverson's country, but in the TV series, especially the 3rd season and the 5th season, we see a ton of Lone Pine footage. So Hopalong Cassidy and the Lone Ranger are the two most associated characters with Lone Pine, and the Lone Ranger is the most associated character with Iversons. Obviously, because the Lone Ranger rocks there, but he filmed all these episodes out there. All those long shots and all those great scenes like the one we're watching right now, all filmed at Iversons. Iversons is also home to the Bat Cave, the outside shot where the Batmobile comes out of the cave. That's at Iversons. Zorro's cave, that's out at Iversons. There's a lot of great stuff out there, but the Lone Ranger is the main character known for that location. Clayton Moore doesn't get a lot of credit for being a great actor. He's one of the greatest actors of all time. He plays the Lone Ranger perfectly. He was a great heavy throughout his entire career. Early on, pre-Lone Ranger, he played some heavies. When he left the series after the second season, and when he was replaced by John Hart, that 2-year run, one season, just the third season, but that 2-year run, because they did 52 episodes a season, except the second season of the Lone Ranger TV series and the 5th season of the Lone Ranger TV series. They only did 26 for the second season because Clayton Moore was fired. And the 5th season, they did 39 episodes, but that was because TV shifted from 52 to 39. That was the standard. But he doesn't get a lot of credit. He doesn't get enough. He's a great actor. Plays the Lone Ranger perfect. Plays a great heavy. Plays the old prospector. Amazing. He plays all these different characters on this show. He really shows that he has a lot of range. And he doesn't give enough credit for that. There's actually an episode of The Range Rider where Clayton Moore is still a young man. It's during the John Hart run as the Lone Ranger. So this is 1952 or 1953, but Clayton Moore is playing the old prospector. On The Range Rider, Clayton Moore is still a young man. He's 38, 39 maybe, somewhere in that range, but he's playing the old prospector because he's that good at doing it. He's a young man, but he's playing an old man, and he's doing fine. It's amazing. I don't remember the name of that episode off the top of my head, but it's a great performance out of Clayton Moore. Here he is at his secret silver mine with Jim Blaine, the ex-ranger that's going to take care of it for him and mine the ore so he can have silver bullets and money for his everyday expenses. And Tonto's looking around, doesn't see where the mine is. And he lifts up the bunk, and there it is. One of the richest strikes of silver ever found in those parts. That's what Jim Blaine's telling us. Now, Clayton Moore is wearing a smaller mask in this episode. Well, I keep going back and forth. Movie, episode, however you want to put it, because this is the second episode of the TV series, The Lone Ranger Fights On. That's what this episode is actually called. And he's wearing the smaller mask. Now, there were 3 different size masks used during the entire run of The Lone Ranger. There was a mask that he wears right now. He would eventually return to wearing this mask for the 5th season of the show, but he had a brief stint where he also wore a mask that covered a little bit of his nose, but then he also wore a mask that covered all of his nose. So there's a few episodes in this Lone Ranger TV series where he has a slightly different mask. Something in between the full mask that covers his nose and the mask that he's wearing currently. There's a few episodes after this where he wears that mask. Pete and Pedro, that's an episode, I believe that's the 6th episode of the Lone Ranger TV series. He's wearing that mask that I'm talking about that's in between, has a little bit of his nose covered. But in this episode, he's wearing the mask that doesn't cover his nose. And you can also see that he's wearing a different shade of gray, because that's what it was. It's like a cream-colored hat, and he has like a blue-green, blue-gray bandana. That's what it was in the black and white filming. His mask is not black. His mask is purple. And the outfit, the uniform in color is blue, but in this it's gray. And when we come back, because right now Tonto's talking to Two Gun Taylor, the sheriff, but when we come back to Clayton Moore, you'll be able to see that Clayton Moore is wearing two different color grays. His shirt is a lighter color than his pants. And that's something that will change over time. His gloves are also slightly different. Sometimes he's wearing a cream color for his gloves, but then sometimes he's wearing what appears to be black, but it's actually a brownish red color. His uniform's very interesting, but all those uniforms of those guys who were in black and white during this era were different. Superman, with George Reeves on The Adventures of Superman, his costume was different. He had a brown and gray costume, so the blue of Superman is gray, and the red for the S and the cape, that was brown. In color, it was red, but on the black and white episodes of the TV show, they were brown. So it's no different here. It just showed up better on black and white film. Because I have seen episodes of the 5th season of this show where they've been decolorized and his outfit appears to be black, even though it's blue. So that the gray looks better, and it makes the appearance that it could be blue. Because everyone at this point in time knew what the Lone Ranger looked like. Because Brace Beamer was doing public appearances. They were transitioning more into this look. And there were all those giveaways. And of course we had the Lone Ranger cereals that had a different look. Because originally when the Lone Ranger started in 1933, he was just a cowboy who wore a mask. He had chaps, had a vest. He was just a regular guy who had a mask. Now, because of this TV, the serials and the TV show and radio and public appearances, all this stuff, now he has an actual uniform. He has an outfit that's unique to him. Just like Batman has a unique outfit to him. Just like Captain America has a unique outfit to him. The Lone Ranger has a uniform now. When he started, there was barely any thought put into it. Let's just have a cowboy who wears a mask and be done with it. He didn't have the white hat. He didn't have any of his trademarks. He just was a regular cowboy. And he didn't have any of the fancy stuff that he would later have. Right now, the Lone Ranger doesn't have any of the fancy stuff. He doesn't have the fancy breastplate. I think that's what they call it for the horse. He doesn't have the fancy saddle. He doesn't have the fancy gun belt. He doesn't have any of that. He doesn't even have two guns in this episode of the Lone Ranger TV series. He still just has the one. Now, a lot of people love when he has the two gun belts crossed, where he has his gun belt and then he has his brother's gun belt. That's something that goes back many, many years, because in the early days of the Lone Ranger, in all the novels and comic books and stuff, he had the two gun belts crossed. He was still just dressed as a regular cowboy, but he had the two gun belts crossed, and I kind of like it. I don't really love it. It's not my favorite thing to have the two gun belts, but for an origin story like they did in the 1981 movie, The Legend of the Lone Ranger, I like it. But I'm not married to it. I like the gun belt that Clayton Moore has and John Hart also wore during this show. That's my favorite Lone Ranger gun belt. That's actually my favorite gun belt of any Western star. There's really no other gun belt like it. I mean, there's some that are fancy. Actually, you know what? I take that back because Wild Bill Hickok, Guy Madison, has the exact same gun belt as the Lone Ranger, just his is brown. So I take that back. We have seen that before. And it's a very nice gun belt. Edward Bolin made that gun belt. Fantastic. And unfortunately, because this is the first time the Lone Ranger is the Lone Ranger, we don't get to see that in this movie. But it is a great gun belt. Now here's a nice fight. And here's another scene that was not used as stock footage, which is surprising. We're seeing a lot of scenes in here that are stock footage that will be used later, and we're going to see over and over again. I'll start to point out some of the scenes that we're going to be seeing over and over again throughout the show, and you'll know them when you see them, but this is not one of them, surprisingly. It's kind of tough to reuse this because he only has the one gun belt, the one holster on his gun belt, I mean, but still, there are some parts in that fight that you could reuse. I accidentally hit pause. I accidentally hit the remote for some reason. I don't know why I did that. But anyways, we're back. Hopefully I still have it synced up right. I'm seeing Glenn Strange holding a gun, and the Lone Ranger and Butch Cavendish are going to come face to face now. And the Lone Ranger just shot the gun out of Glenn Strange's hand, a.k.a. Butch Cavendish. And now his men have their hands up. So hopefully we're synced up together. I don't know why I hit pause. That was a stupid move. Now, one thing that I always thought that could have been done better on this show, that was done better on radio and was done better in comic books and novels and stuff, is I never thought there was enough emotion between the Lone Ranger and Butch Cavendish. Butch Cavendish is supposed to be the Lone Ranger's arch nemesis, but I just don't have that same feeling that I get from other versions of the Lone Ranger in this episode. I don't get that from this. You would think that the Lone Ranger would be more intense when it comes to Butch Cavendish. This is the guy who killed his brother. This is the guy who killed his friends. He doesn't have that same kind of emotion in this movie. He doesn't have that. It's kind of disappointing. And the return of Butch Cavendish that happens later in this season, we still don't get it. We don't get it here, and we don't get it then. One thing that I always found very interesting about this show, and a lot of the westerns of the day, is that there's really no continuity to these shows. And as I'm saying this, here's the second episode ending. So the Lone Ranger riding away, that ends the second episode. So now the footage that we're watching currently is the third episode of the Lone Ranger TV series. Two Gun Taylor and Doc Drummond fighting the rest of the Butch Cavendish gang. This is in the third episode of the Lone Ranger TV series. The Lone Ranger's Triumph. I think that's what it's called. I might have messed up. I think the second episode is the Lone Ranger fights on. I think the third episode is the Lone Ranger's Triumph. I think I got that right. I haven't really watched this that much because I watched this for many, many years on VHS and on DVD and on TV, so I've kind of abandoned this version of Enter the Lone Ranger because I've seen it so many times. So sometimes I forget some of this stuff when it comes to titles. And because all these episodes are in public domain, they've been published in different places so many times that you kind of try to avoid it because it's so available. And you seek out the stuff that isn't that available. Because there's some episodes of this show that you have to get the full box set that they put out a few years ago to get those episodes. But I think I got that right when it comes to the titles. But anyways, back to continuity. There really is no continuity in this show because Butch Cavendish is played by Glenn Strange in multiple episodes. These 3 episodes and then one more later on in season 1 called Never Say Die. That's the return of Butch Cavendish. Breaks out of jail, kidnaps the warden's son, uses him as bait to either get his gang released or the boy will die. Very straightforward plot, and then the Lone Ranger gets involved, and away we go. But anyways, Glenn Strange plays Butch Cavendish in 4 episodes, but there's an episode of the Lone Ranger TV series from season 3 called Gunpowder Joe. It's a John Hart episode, and in that episode, the 3 villains are the last living members of the Cavendish gang, and Glenn Strange, who plays Butch Cavendish in that episode, he's one of the last surviving members, but he's not Butch Cavendish. He plays just a regular outlaw, which I think is very interesting. But there's no continuity to this show. So Tris Coffin, who plays Dan Reed in this movie, he was brought back several times because he's just an actor. In a lot of these westerns that came around in the 60s and 70s, the adult westerns, that era, there is that continuity. So if you play character X, you're just character X. You can't be brought back to play Y and Z at a later date. In this show, these are just actors playing characters. These people, their look is not who the character actually is. There were some guys who were recurring. The guys who played Barnaby Boggs, they were used a few times. Some of the guys played the same character, but they didn't really stay that loyal to it because they recast at a later date. Here's a fight scene that will be used later on. Billy the Great is an episode of the Lone Ranger TV series that used that fight scene that Jay Silverheels, a.k.a. Tonto, was just involved. Here's another scene of Tonto getting on his horse. That will be used at a later date. Here's another scene that will be used at a later date. The Lone Ranger and Tonto are looking for a trail in a few episodes, and this is the scene that they splice in. And it becomes very obvious when you see it in a show because Clayton Moore has the smaller mask and Silver doesn't have the fancy saddle and stuff. So that's been used a lot, that scene. We're about to see another scene where that happens again. That's been used over and over again. It's coming up very soon. Here it is. Lone Ranger and Tonto searching, and then they're going to get off their horses, and then they're going to inspect this horse, and they've used that scene again. So there's a lot of stuff in this episode that they reused. The early episodes, the first 6 or 7, they really reused a lot of that footage. Here, they used a lot of it, but not as much as they could have, because there are scenes that are in this that are just unique to this episode. And one thing that you have to also notice when you watch this is we're not seeing any stages, really. There are a few scenes where they're using sound stages, but mostly this is shot on location at Iverson's ranch, which was not common later on in this show. They would be solely on stages, and you could really tell. Here we are in the great, big, wide open at Iverson's, and we're getting really, really strong production values because we're on location and not on stages. I don't have a problem with them shooting on stages. The sound stages that they used, I don't have a problem with them. You can really tell in the later episodes when they abandoned going on location a bunch like they are right now. This is all location. But when they went to using sound stages primarily, it really did affect the production values. Not enough to turn anyone off. The show was still very, very popular, and the people who loved it then still love it now. So it didn't bring it down too much, but some people, it does bother them that, hey, we're on a stage. We're not actually out in the desert or the plains or whatever. That shot of Tonto doing the old hoot owl, or whatever you want to call it, that was used 1,000 times. Of course, I'm exaggerating. It wasn't actually used 1,000 times. It was used a few. And that shot of Clayton Moore creeping behind the rocks, that was used in a few episodes. There's a box set that this 3-episode saga comes in. It's got all the episodes. There's about 16 episodes that are in public domain. 15 black and white and 1 color episode called Message from Abe. And the reason why that fell into public domain is unclear, but the reason why they include it in these box sets is to show the evolution of the show. So we have the first 15 episodes, and then you add in an episode from 6 or 7 years later, and you can clearly see that the production values have gone up. It's in color. There's a lot of great stuff there. But in a trivia section of that DVD set, if you get an answer wrong, they show that clip that we just saw of Butch Cavendish getting punched. So I always thought that was interesting. There's Clayton Moore with that unique riding style that only he has. He really, really chokes up on the reins. You can always tell that it's Clayton Moore riding just by the way he rides. If it doesn't look like that, then it's probably a stuntman. But he did basically all the riding. There really is no scene throughout the history of this show where you can clearly see that it's someone else doing the riding. Now, there are scenes in later episodes, the 4th season mainly, where John Hart is doing some of the riding because they've used stock footage from one of his episodes, but it's Clayton Moore, and vice versa. There's episodes from season 2 that they showed in season 3, even though John Hart was the Lone Ranger and not Clayton Moore, but it's Clayton Moore riding. So if you hate stock footage, if you're not a fan of stock footage, but you have interest in the Lone Ranger, this is a great thing for you, because there's no stock footage here because it's the beginning of the show. Now, if you hate stock footage and that bothers you, I don't recommend watching a lot of these episodes back to back, because you'll see some of the same scenes reused, or you might be totally turned off to the show. If you hate stock footage, because this, you could really teach a class on how to properly use stock footage just by showing this show. Because they would have certain scenes that would be scripted in their scripts, blocking out, okay, we're going to use this scene taken from this, we're going to put that in there so we don't have to shoot that. If we do a low doo-doo. If we do have a scene where it requires stock footage, or a long shot, sorry, if we have to be outside, we can not do that and save us some time and money and just use stock footage. Like if we have to have a stagecoach chase or something like that we've already done. But you can definitely teach a class on stock footage from this show, because the way they do it is just brilliant. The way they were able to edit together. And that's one thing that gets overlooked, is the editing of these shows. You have to have a strong editor working these shows. We're going to talk about it at the end of this commentary track, but have you noticed something about this movie? There's something missing in this movie. Have you guessed what that is? Have you figured it out yet? We're going to tell you at the end, but have you figured out what's missing? I know what's missing. It's very obvious to me. Let's see if you caught it. But there's something missing that's very obvious. So here we have, this is a pretty interesting little bit they do in this movie, where they're talking about buildings on fire and stuff. It's kind of funny. Here's this guy just got out of bed, thinks he has it made because he's a member of the Butch Cavendish gang and he got this job that he doesn't deserve. And now he's going to jail. It's still hard to tell if these guys are corrupt or they're just on Cavendish's... Well, they are corrupt because they're on Cavendish's payroll, but it's hard to tell if these guys are actually crooked. Like, are they good at their job? Are they doing the right things when they're in that job? Or are they crooked? And they're doing bad for the community. That's what I always thought was interesting about this scene, that we don't actually know any background on these people. We know they're a part of the Cavendish gang, but what are they doing in these jobs? And now Butch Cavendish is having a nice meal, talking over with his gang, and now he's going to ride into Colby and take over the town. So he thinks. here's another scene that's been used over and over again. Now we're getting a lot more scenes that will be used later on. This fight scene right here will be used several times throughout the run of this show. This little fight scene here between the guys from Colby, led by the Lone Ranger and Sheriff Two Gun Taylor, and the Butch Cavendish gang. Cavendish is laying back, seeing his little empire crumble. And now Tonto has brought in reinforcements, and Butch is like, well, I gotta get out of here. It's a little bit disappointing that we don't get a big fight scene at the end of this. Butch Cavendish is wounded, so he's just trying to get away. It's too bad that we don't get that big fight scene at the end, because that's what we really deserve and is what this movie's calling for. But of course, there's some forces that are playing against this. Obviously, because of him being wounded, it would hinder him fighting. And then the second thing is we have runtime to worry about, because this is an episode of a TV series that only is supposed to run 22 minutes. So we get this big riding scene and we don't have time for a fight scene. So when this riding scene is over with, we've used up valuable time that could have been for this fight scene that we're never going to get. So this little scene with Clayton Moore riding, it's been used in stock footage. In some openings of the Lone Ranger TV series, I'll point it out when we see it. It's been used right here. Okay, so right now we're seeing Butch Cavendish riding. When we see the Lone Ranger ride, that was used in one of the openings for the show. So Clayton Moore riding right here at Iverson's. And this music that you're hearing, obviously some of you probably aren't watching this movie or don't have the sound on, but this music was used in the 1938 and 1939 Lone Ranger serials. They used all this same music, and on radio also. Okay. A little bit anticlimactic here. He just pulls a Derringer, and the Lone Ranger is going to be ready for it, and he shoots it out of his hand. And that's it. Kind of a bummer that we don't get a big fight scene at the end. Have you figured it out yet? Have you figured out what's missing in this movie? There's one thing that's missing. It's a very important thing that's missing. We haven't seen it. Now, there are some things working against having what we're missing in this movie, because there isn't enough time. There could be, some of these people could not be that, and we could add one of these in, but we're missing it. Have you figured out what it is yet? What are we missing? There's one big thing that we're missing, and that kind of ruins this movie a little bit for me, because if you don't have one of these, it really hurts a Western, in my opinion. And you're probably wondering now, what is it? What are we missing? Well, we're missing a woman. There's no women at all in Enter the Lone Ranger, this edited together movie of the first 3 episodes of the Lone Ranger TV series. There's not a woman in sight. There really isn't even a woman as a background player in this. And that's what we're missing. You know, all the great Western movies, High Noon, Once Upon a Time in the West, all these great Westerns, they all have a beautiful leading lady in that movie. And that's what really makes a Western. You can't have a great Western without a beautiful leading lady. And in this movie, we don't get that. So I can't really say this is a great Western just because of that. It's a great opening to the show. It tells us a lot. It gets everyone excited, but that little thing missing really hurts this. But it was an enjoyable experience. Could have been a little bit better with a leading lady, but hey, we can't complain too much. But I hope you enjoyed the ride. I hope this was an enjoyable experience for you. I had a fun time watching this. And hopefully you thought I gave you some interesting information. And we're going to come back and do the 1956 Lone Ranger movie with Clayton Moore and Jay Silverheels at a later date. We're going to try to do all of the Lone Ranger movies except the 2013 Lone Ranger movie with Johnny Depp and Armie Hammer, unless we get a lot of people who are interested in having me do a commentary track for that movie. It's going to be a little bit hard for me to do that because I'm not that familiar with that movie because I've only seen it once or twice, and I'm not a fan of it. I'm a fan of Enter the Lone Ranger. I'm a fan of the 1956 movie. I'm a fan of the Lone Ranger and the Lost City of Gold. I'm a fan of The Legend of the Lone Ranger from 1981. I'm a fan of the 2003 WB Lone Ranger TV movie. I'm a fan of all those, so it's going to be very easy for me to do those commentary tracks. It's going to be difficult for me to do the Disney Lone Ranger one because I'm not a fan of that. And I don't own it. I don't have it on DVD. I don't have it on Blu-ray. I don't have it streaming anywhere. So that's going to be difficult for me to do because I have to go out and get it somehow. I don't really want to pay for it. So that's going to be difficult. And I don't know it that well because I've only seen it a few times. It's easy for me to do commentary tracks on some of these Lone Ranger movies because I've seen them 1,000 times. I've seen this 1,000 times. I've seen The Lost City of Gold 1,000 times. So I don't know. If you guys want me to do the 2013 Lone Ranger movie with Johnny Depp, I'll do it. But for now, set in stone, we're going to do the Lone Ranger from 1956, then we're going to do the Lone Ranger and the Lost City of Gold, and then we're going to do the Legend of the Lone Ranger from 1981, and then we're going to do the WB 2003 made-for-TV movie, The Lone Ranger. So I hope you've enjoyed this commentary track for Enter the Lone Ranger, and until next time, adios.